Hello students. In the last lecture, we discussed about Muhammad Ayub's Subaltern Realism, which argues that the dominant paradigm in international relations, such as realism and liberalism, failed to explain adequately two of the central issues in the international system. First, the origin of the majority of the conflicts, and second, the behavior of the majority of the states belonging to the global south. These paradigms failed because they formulate generalizations from limited data drawn from a restricted universe and because they also lack historical depth. Both these flaws are related to inequality in the arena of knowledge production in international relations, which in turn is a reflection of the inequality in material capabilities in the international system. A supplementary perspective is therefore needed to correct this situation through subaltern realism, which was based on 4 key assumptions and 5 conflict variables which we discussed in the previous lecture. With the above backdrop, we will now evaluate subaltern realism and discuss the unifying elements of different realist traditions. We will end our discussion with some major concluding remarks. So, let us make an assessment of subaltern realism. Despite many strengths in Ayub's theory of subaltern realism, it is not devoid of criticisms. First, critics argue that subaltern realism, while aiming to provide a non-Western perspective, still relies heavily on Western theoretical frameworks and concepts, potentially neglecting the indigenous theories and experience of non-Western countries or countries belonging to the global south. Secondly, subaltern realism is criticized for maintaining a state-centric focus similar to traditional realism, which has overlooked the non-state actors, social movements and transnational dynamics that increasingly shape global politics nowadays. Finally, critics contend that subaltern realism has not sufficiently differentiated between various subaltern perspectives and experiences, potentially oversimplifying the diversity of non-Western political realities. Despite this, subaltern realism perspective incorporates majority of the states in the international system into its analysis of state behavior and interstate conflict. It takes a different view of the challenges facing the states and factors motivating their behavior than in comparison to Neo-Realism. Furthermore, by identifying internal disorder as a primary cause of interstate conflict, subaltern realism promotes a more modern conception of security when compared to Neo-Realism, which views security as a purely external issue. So, the main contribution of subaltern realism is that they are talking of both internal security and external security. They are not just talking of external security. That was the exclusive focus of the Neo-Realist. So, that is how you can differentiate Walters from Muhammad Ayub, because Walters were talking about external security and Muhammad Ayub is talking of the relationship between internal security and external security. Finally, subaltern realism is conscious of the historical time period in which it was formulated and able to adapt itself as a result. So, what Muhammad Ayub is saying that is relevant for these countries, countries belonging to global south, because they are daily facing this kind of issues, these kind of problems, and they are not bothered about what is happening in the international arena, how the Americans are trying to counter China, how the Chinese are interested in countering United States. These are important for these countries, these are important for the world, but you are not worried about this because you are confronting your day-to-day bread and water issues, legitimacy issue, domestic disorder, chaos, fraud in elections, problem of coup, problem of democracy. So these issues are important for you. So you are not giving any priority or any kind of importance to these kind of issues faced by the developed countries. Therefore, we can draw three important conclusions when we compare subaltern realism with neo-realism. First, neo-realism possesses little explanatory ability for a majority of the world. So as I said, whatever the neo-realists are saying, that may be good for America, for China, maybe for Russia, but it is not good for, or it doesn't explain anything or in a substantial way the problem these countries are facing in their day-to-day life. Second, subaltern realism is more convincing and credible as a higher theory, as it represents a superior alternative to neo-realism. So as a theory it is widely acceptable because it talks about the majority of the states, it talks about the majority of the population in this part of the world. So in that way it is more convincing and more credible than neo-realism. Third, and most significantly, realism required some rehabilitation due to the failings of neo-realism, and this has been achieved through the application of Ives' theory of subaltern realism. So when there was the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and where there were a lot of criticisms by the alternative theories to the mainstream theory like realism, so there was a kind of problem in realism, and in that time Ives had a better explanation that in fact rehabilitated realism, that in fact saved realism from its status as a mainstream theory of international relations. So that is Ives' contribution to realism. Now let us focus on the question of the unifying elements of different traditions. So we have discussed about classical realism, we discussed about the structural realism, the offensive realism, the neoclassical realism, and again the subaltern realism by Muhammad Ayub. But now the question is whether there is any commonality between all these traditions or they are all different from each other, and we cannot call them as a realist theory, rather we can call them as realist theories. Is that the question? So we will basically discuss this issue now. Thus, realism is a theoretical broad church embracing a variety of thinkers and texts. As we have seen, it has a long tradition starting from Kautilya, starting from Sun Tzu, starting from Thucydides. Despite the numerous denominations, all realists however subscribe to the following three S, that is statism, survival and self-help. So these are the three S that unifies all the different strands of realism or all the traditions of realism. Statism is a central assumption of realism. This involves two claims. First, the state is the preeminent actor in world politics. So we may have different traditions, but all the traditions are unanimous on this point, that state is the preeminent actor in international politics. And if you want to understand the true nature of international politics, you have to understand the state as a preeminent actor. Second, state sovereignty signifies the existence of an independent political community, one that has juridical authority over its territory. So state is important, so also its sovereignty, because that gives a unique kind of personality to the state, and this sovereignty over the territory of the state and the sovereign equal status in international politics, this is a variable, this is a point on the basis of which all traditions of realism they agree on. But the problem is, when statism, you are talking of statism, that is again not accepted by many of the higher scholars, both on empirical grounds, like there are so many challenges to the power of the state, both from above and below. Now we have already discussed how the process of globalization, process of information technology revolution from the above, and the problem of terrorism both from the above and below, how that is affecting the concept of state building process, your national sovereignty. Again, that is a point that we cannot ignore. On normative grounds also, like the inability of sovereign states to respond to collective global problems such as famine, environmental degradation, human rights abuses, these are also the issues that affects your sovereignty, that also affects your reputation as a sovereign equal state. If you have human rights problem domestically, if you are creating environmental problem, if you are not taking a strong position on many issues such as the pandemic, maybe on famine, on these issues, your reputation as a state would definitely decline. China can claim itself as as a major world power, but if it doesn't take into account the human rights record of many of its ethnic communities that has been severely criticized by many other countries, so you lose your moral position. So Pakistan claim on Kashmir is also the same. If you talk about Kashmir, if you talk about the Kashmiris, so you have to first treat your Kashmiris, your part of Kashmir in a better way. So that should be, the Kashmiris living in Pakistan, in China, they should enjoy better position, better living standard. Otherwise, you have no local standing. You can't criticize India if you, just don't follow any good policy towards your own Kashmiris. So that is again the problem in international relations. So this is again the question of finding problem from both inside, finding the problem from outside, and your normative grounds that should also being now challenged by many scholars, many forces. So this is one factor that we cannot ignore. So survival is the primary objective of all states, and that is the supreme national interest of which all the leaders must adhere. So the problem is, all the streams of realism, they are talking of state survival. They are talking of the power distribution, how you can use different sources, different elements of power to ensure your survival. That is a point agreed by all the realists. But again, there are problems that there is no limit to what you can do in international politics. So what is the limit of your survival? In the name of survival, you can accumulate a lot of weapons, you can threaten others, you can follow very aggressive policy. So China can't claim that it is just acquiring those weapons for its survival. Maybe they are right from their perspective, but from our perspective, you need just minimum nuclear weapons to counter the other countries. So there is no point in accumulating more and more nuclear weapons as the superpowers did during the Cold War period. So you need some amount of nuclear weapons, number of nuclear weapons that can in a reasonable way counter the other adversary. But if you engage in continuous arms race, in continuous arms production, that is not only dangerous for you as a country, but it is also problematic for other countries. We have seen how countries like Pakistan and North Korea, they are economically in a very precarious condition, but they are all nuclear weapon states. So cannot expect others to help you always. They will help you once or twice. So the problem is you cannot engage yourself and waste your all natural resources in the name of security, in the name of attaining parity against your adversary. So that is again the problem. Another point that unites all the brands of realism is the concept of self-help, that no other state or international institution can be relied to guarantee your own survival. This is fine. This is a point that unites all the strands of realism. But there are problems that self-help is not the inevitable consequence of the absence of world government. Rather, it's a logic the states have selected. So self-help is good, but at the same time we should not think of this only, and or we'll forget about the cooperative aspect of international politics. Both cooperation and conflict, they are the twin principles on the basis of which the international politics operates. So we have to focus both on power dimension, both on the cooperation dimension. We have to focus on the self-help. At the same time, we also have to think about the role of international institutions, particularly how they are dealing with the global issues, the issues that affects the whole planet. It's not about state security only. It's also a question of individual security. It's also a question of your region security. It's also a question of comprehensive security, that by combining the national security with individual security, with regional security, with the planetary security, you have to think of security in a very broad way. It's not just question of military security. You have to think of economic security. You have to think about in your internal security. You have to think about your political stability, social stability. Security has expanded its ambit. So as a nation, you have to depend on your self-help, no problem. But you have to think also about the importance of international law, international norms, international organizations, because that will help you to address the cooperative aspect which are needed for addressing the current global challenges we are facing, like environment, like terrorism. Moreover, there are examples where states have preferred collective security systems or form of regional security arrangement in preference to self-help. Sometimes, we discussed about the issue of, supranational organization like the European Union or ASEAN. So sometimes you surrender your sovereignty, you surrender a part of your power so that you establish an institution that will take care of your security needs. May not be 100% military needs, but sometimes you have to put your faith in those institutions, because history shows that they have been successful in addressing so many regional challenges. So it's not that you are always facing the military problem. Military security is an important part of state security, there is no doubt about it, there is no second opinion about it, but military security is not the only problem you are facing. There are global issues, there are regional issues, there are local issues that are again important for you. So we have to combine both the cooperative and the competitive aspect of international politics. So that is the main argument. And now let us focus on the concluding points. There are many criticisms against realism. We know that there are so many strengths of realism, there are so many criticisms against realism. There are so many critics who criticize realism because it's regarded as a one-dimensional theory that is too narrowly focused. As I said, realism is talking of military security, and in fact they have given much more importance to military security, which is only a part of state security. So that is the problem. Second, realism fails to capture the extent to which international politics is a dialogue of different higher voices and perspective. We already discussed about this issue. So cooperation is also an important part of international politics. So realists are not talking of cooperation, and they think that if states are talking of cooperation, that also in a relative way, that whether that cooperation will add to the state's power or not. So everything they interpret in terms of power. So that is again criticized by some of the higher scholars. Then there is emancipatory theory that claims that power politics is outdated because security is now a local problem within the disorganized and sometimes failed states, and also at the same time is a cosmopolitan problem of people everywhere regardless of their citizenship. So according to the emancipatory problem, security of major countries that is looked after by the realist theory, that doesn't actually explain many of the problems faced by the citizens of the failed states, the citizens of the countries belonging to global south. So they are finding different kind of problems, and nowadays we are not talking about country specific issues, rather we have become cosmopolitan, we have become global citizens. So from citizen you have become a netizen, from a local citizen you have become a global citizen, because now you can comment on global issues, you can comment on some issues that is going on in other parts of the world, because you are a human being, because you are a global citizen. And so we have only one globe, we have only one planet, and all the issues affecting the planet, affecting the mother earth, that is all important for you. That's why you are active in social media, that's why you are raising those issues in social media. So that is again another problem that we cannot forget. But despite this, issues raised by realist thinkers starting from Thucydides, Sun Tzu and Kautilya for state and interstate relations continue to be relevant today, and because they give realism its timeless quality. So whatever the issues raised by this earlier realist or the classical realist or the neo-realist or maybe subaltern realist, whatever they are saying, that definitely help us to understand international politics in some significant way. So we cannot forget their contribution, because whatever they are saying, they are not saying out of the air. Whatever they are looking, whatever is happening in the world, they are talking about that. So in that way, realism or the writings of these thinkers, it has become timeless, because so long as we find the problem in international politics in terms of military security, in terms of Russia-Ukraine war, points raised by the realist, that will again become relevant. There is also little doubt that the collective wisdom of the realist tradition is helpful in understanding some of the enduring patterns of contemporary world politics. So we cannot forget the importance of power. So we have to understand that military security is important, economic security is important, social security is important, human security is also important. But military security has become an added importance, or it has got an added importance, particularly in the recent period, as we have seen in case of Russia and Ukraine, as we can see it from West Asia when the war is going on between Israel and Hamas. So military security is an important part of our understanding of international politics. So it is not the only aspect, it is one of the most important aspects that we cannot ignore. The question of realism's resilience touches on one of central claims that it embodies laws of international politics that remain true across time and space. Whatever they are saying, so that is basically it is relevant, it was relevant, it is it will be relevant. So what they said, what they wrote, what they argued, that was relevant to the ancient world, that was relevant to the medieval period, that is relevant at present, and maybe it may be relevant in future also. So the point is that is the reason why it has got a kind of across time relevance, like historical importance it has got, and irrespective of the geographical division, it is again important for all the countries and all the continents. So that we cannot question. Thus, while political context change, realists believe that the world continues to operate according to the logic of power, and of course you cannot equate power with realism. So there are so many changes in the world, there are so many changes in the political context of the world, but at the same time the scholars of international politics, particularly the realist scholars of international politics, they think that the world operates, the world performs, the world functions on the logic of realism, that is power politics. So this is an important dimension of international politics. This is the reason why some higher scholars consider realism as an ideology rather than a theory of international politics. So as realism has acquired a new kind of importance in the current fight between the nation states, and because it was relevant earlier, it is important now, and it may continue to be important in the world so long as there are nation states, so long as there are sovereign states. So we cannot ignore the importance of realism in international politics, and that is the reason why most of the scholars consider those particularly believe in the power politics. Of course, they believe that it has become got a kind of ideological status. It has become itself an ideology rather than a theory of international politics. So those who are the realists, they believe realism as an ideology rather than a theory of international politics. That is the argument. Let us now summarize what we have discussed so far. Despite some criticisms, subaltern realism incorporates majority of states into its analysis. Secondly, it takes a different view of the challenges facing states belonging to global south. Third, it identifies internal disorder as a primary cause of interstate conflict. And finally, it is conscious of the historical time period in which it was formulated. We also discussed that despite numerous denominations, all realist traditions subscribe to 3 S. One S stands for statism, another S stands for survival, and the third S stands for self-help. There are serious criticisms that realism is a one-sided theory which focuses on the conflictual side of state behavior, and the whole concept of security is also changing, as we have seen, from state security to human security. Finally, despite those criticisms, the issues raised by realism for the state and interstate relations continue to be relevant across time, that is irrespective of the historical period and space that refers to geopolitics. In the next lecture, we will discuss about classical liberal theory in international relations, which is considered as another mainstream theory in international politics. Thank you for your attention. Thank you once again.